Okay, so let's discuss natural resource management. So, first of all, recycling is oftentimes one of the main things that people cite when they think about sustainability. So, I've encountered this many times when I've talked about sustainability, and people, I'll say, yeah, if they ask, what do you mean by sustainability? They'll say, oh, you mean like recycling. Now, this is really common. Recycling is an important part of sustainability. It's one I think that people have probably more experience with than most. And so you're probably familiar with this symbol, okay? You have your reduce, reuse, recycle. Okay, so it's kind of in a circular thing here to indicate constant resource recycling. Um, but I think what not a lot of people realize is that reduce, reuse, recycle is actually it's if you're going to reduce your impact on natural resources, it's actually, you can think of it as a priority list. And so reduce, reuse, recycle is actually an order of preference. In other words, the best thing to do if we want to reduce our impact on natural resources is to reduce. So reduce just means don't use it in the first place. So the most effective way to reduce waste is to not create it in the first place. So reducing waste just means, instead of, if you think of bottled water, instead of, buying the bottle of water, just don't, buy the bottle in the first place. Whereas reuse, if you think of in terms of, continue our bottled water example. So think about how you could reuse something, and a good example is using a reusable water bottle, an Nalgene bottle or a stainless steel bottle or whatever. Okay, so um, the best way to, minimize your impact is just to not use a bottle in the first place. Maybe use a glass or whatever. That's kind of reusing in a way. Reuse would be to use something that's reusable. And then recycle, which is actually our third best way to minimize our impact, would be to use, if you use a plastic bottle, to recycle the plastic bottle. Okay, so I want you to think of that. Reduce, reuse, recycle is that, think of it as a priority list in terms of our minimizing our impact. Okay, so if I want you to think about why reduction and reuse are preferable to recycling. So think about the differences between those, and go ahead and press pause and think about that. So there's a lot of benefits to reduction and reuse. You think about recycling. Recycling is great. Don't get me wrong. It's really a great way to reduce our impact. But you think about, recycling. You probably have recycling on that you can put at your curbside. Well, think about just the fact that a truck has to come and pick that up. So the truck uses a lot of energy. It's very, probably getting maybe 5 miles a gallon. And then of course to uh, process these, whether it's a plastic bottle or an aluminum can or whatever, in order to process them in this big facility, you need to use energy, there's resources that are used, and there's going to be some waste in that process. Okay, so you can prevent pollution because you don't have to use the energy. If you're reducing, that's the best way to do it. Again, you eliminate the need to use energy in the first place for that resource. Um, and that's emissions, that's pollution, saving energy, saving money, reducing waste overall. So recycling is great, but it uses energy. There's going to be some waste. There's always a little bit of loss when you recycle a good. It costs a little bit of money. Whereas reduction, you eliminate all of those impacts. So I want you to think about that next time you think about, waste reduction. Recycling is a great thing, but actually there are other ways that are much better to reduce your impact on natural resources. So if you think about some ways that we can reuse, so think about some practical ways that you can reuse in your life. So these are just some suggestions. You can buy used products instead of buying new things. Um, you can look for products with less packaging. That would be actually more reduction than anything. Buy reusable items, maintain and repair what you have. So instead of, if your lawnmower breaks or whatever, figure out how to fix it. Don't go buy a new one. Borrow, rent. So, share with your friends, barter. They have clothing swaps from time to time. Go to Goodwill or a Salvation Army or whatever. And also, if you're done with your what you're going to use, you absolutely don't need it anymore. You don't want to repair it. You don't want to keep it. Think about donating it instead of throwing it away. Okay. Now, of course, recycling is really important too. So recycling is preferable to throwing things out. Okay. and you think about all the benefits of recycling, it does prevent pollution, it helps reduce impacts, it reduces emissions. So there's some really amazing, I won't go over a few statistics here in a minute, the amount of resources, energy use, and emissions that are reduced by recycling things. It just requires an awful lot less resources to recycle than to get it from raw materials. And sort of extending the reduce, reuse, recycle, there is something called waste to energy, so you can incinerate waste and generate energy from it. So that's a, it's a better option than landfilling. So of all of these options, the worst thing you can do is throw it in a landfill. It's almost never going to biodegrade. It's just going to sit there. It can cause pollution. It can cause leaching. It can cause passage, smells, all kinds of stuff. So landfilling should be our last option when it comes to our waste management. Okay. So just to look at a few statistics, this is relatively recent data from the EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and you can see that the stuff, this is household waste. Okay, it's great. I mean, recycling, we're at 35%, give or take. And then the rest, 65%, is thrown away. And about 13% is that used to generate energy. And then about 53% of all the waste, the household waste in the United States, ends up in a landfill. So that's pretty embarrassing, not so good. So this should be, this could be way down. So there's an infographic in your reading just to show you some statistics. So 2013, about 87 million tons of municipal solid waste. So that's this percentage. So this 35% is this 87 million tons. So if you do a little quick math, that means about 160 or so million tons ended up either in a landfill or incinerated, and about 100, let's say 110 million tons ended up in a landfill each year. So that's a lot. So, but the good news is by recycling this 87 million tons, we eliminated more than 186 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is the same as pulling 39 million passenger vehicles off the road. So, I mean, again, recycling is not the top priority, but by recycling, just in the U.S., it's the amount of emissions that are saved are equivalent to taking about 40 million vehicles off the road. Okay. And also the energy, it takes a lot less energy to recycle something than it does to make it from raw materials. So you're saving about 1.1 quadrillion BTUs of energy. That's about 1% of all energy in the United States, or enough to consumed by about 10 million homes in a year. So feel free to look through all that infographic. I mean, again, I want to hit home that even though recycling is not shouldn't be the top priority, it is very, very important, and that in the absence of being able to reduce or reuse, we do want to recycle because it has major, major impacts in the United States and globally. So there is, if you look at how resources are normally used, and this was kind of peppered throughout the readings for this week, the usual resource flow, the way we use natural resources, okay, is this linear resource flow. So linear resource flow. So the basic process, in a kind of simplified way, we pull natural resource from the environment. So this could be oil, it could be copper, it could be trees, whatever the case may be. Okay, so we extract it from nature. We ship it and run it through a factory. We manufacture something. Okay, so we're manufacturing goods. Think of, whatever, copper wire or paper or clothing or whatever. Okay, so we have a factory that makes this stuff. And then we send it somewhere to sell it. Okay, then it goes to a consumer, you or anyone else that buys the good. Now with linear resource flow, you start with extraction, you work your way through, someone uses it, and then it ends up in a landfill or possibly being converted into energy. And so this is linear because you're just moving it from one, you're basically pulling natural resources and then you're dumping them out somewhere else and they're not being reused. Okay. Now this is really important because this is the way we normally do things, but there are ways to sort of close the loop and do what's called a circular resource flow. So circular resource flow is if you can reuse your resources. So if you could take this, what normally goes into a landfill, and we could loop back around and take the natural resources out of it, okay? Think of recycling paper, as one example. So if you threw paper in the landfill, it's not really getting recycled back into our economy. But if we can, instead of dumping it in a landfill, we take the paper, we recycle it, and then we basically pull out the raw materials, and it's so we can use that instead of cutting down trees, we can go right to the manufacturing, and so we can close this loop. Okay. Now you could think of reuse. Maybe with reuse, you're instead of going here, you're giving it to another person, or maybe you're donating it to a store that's giving it to another person. So you can see the resources can kind of go through in this circular manner. So that's circular resource flow versus linear resource flow. Okay. And when you think about this process is pretty wasteful. Um, if you remember from the reading, the stuff that you throw away. So this was a statistic in one of the readings. For every can of waste that you throw in the garbage, if you look at the impacts, the amount of materials that were used to generate that thing that you use, that waste that you generated, because all along the line you're losing parts. It's like when if it's a tree, you're harvesting or I mean, if it's paper, you're harvesting the tree, and then you lose some of the tree in the process, you lose some of the paper in the process, using a lot of energy, which is kind of wasteful and so forth. So by the time you throw away a can of something in the trash, about 87 cans of raw materials are actually used to generate that resource. This is, an industry-wide average. The whole point here is that you look at the upstream cost of the stuff that you're throwing in the landfill, it's a lot bigger than just what you throw away. And they also state a statistic, and this should be pretty familiar from our ecological footprint discussion, that if everyone wasted like we do in the US, we'd need about 5 Earths to provide all of the materials. Okay, so instead of doing the linear resource flow, we need this systemic change. So we need to figure out a way to reuse our resources, and we can use this circular resource flow. So there is this concept called zero waste. Okay, and we can try to do this. And so the concept of waste is it's necessarily a human concept. Nature doesn't waste anything, right? So everything's reused in nature, at least over a certain time scale. So waste is really a human construct. So if we could go away from this system where we have these raw materials, okay, so we have this extracted raw materials, the thickness of this line is proportional to the amount of materials. So as our materials flow through our system, right, are designed and manufactured, this is where it's used, and this is that end of life, the destruction part. So most of it goes, you see the thickness of the line, most of it ends up in a landfill. Some of it we compost, okay? Some of it we can use to generate electricity through incineration. Now this is that closing the loop side of thing, right? So if we burn it and we get some energy from it, so we can use that energy to feed the system again, okay? We can recycle it and feed it back in the system. We can reuse it and feed it back in the system. So if you would add up all these circular resource flows that are going back into our system, okay, so this whole line, the thickness of this line, is our raw materials plus what we're reusing. Hopefully you can see that. But you can see a lot of that we're landfilling, some of it we're composting, which is not so bad, but a majority of it we're throwing in a landfill. So imagine what this flow chart would look like if we were at or near zero waste. So we want to almost entirely close the loop. Think about what the impact on raw material. So if we had this much material flowing through our system, but we're basically having a circular resource flow for most of it, imagine the impact on raw materials, and this is kind of what it would look like. And so again, this thickness here, this is the same amount of resources flowing through the economy as here, same thickness, okay? But you notice because we're recycling a lot of it and we're reusing even more of it, a little bit is going to compost, none of it's going to the landfill. So if we could design our system, right, systemic change, so we may, okay, so we need to compost a little bit that's not going back. But other than that, notice how little raw materials we're taking from the earth versus this big thick line, because we're basically we're dumping a lot into the atmosphere in terms of pollution and dumping a lot into landfills. By replacing that and closing this loop, we can really eliminate the amount of raw materials. So you can imagine the impact on the environment, right? So if we don't have to cut down as many trees, dig up as much oil, mine for as many raw materials, harvest food, all this kind of stuff. If we can minimize our impact on the natural environment, that could be one goal of our waste system. Okay, so it's changing this whole system. So everything is a circular resource flow. Very important concept in natural resource management. And this is effectively, I mean, you've been doing this probably all your life when you recycle. You're actually contributing to the circular resource flow. We just need to enhance it more than it is right now. Okay, so that's the concept of zero waste, which is based on circular versus linear resource flow. Okay, so now let's get into a couple of certification ways that we know that we're being less damaging by using resources. So we need resources, right? I mean, you need food, you need paper, you need certain things to live your life. So as a consumer, if I want to try to be a responsible consumer, it's hard to know what is good to buy, what's less damaging to buy than other things. I mean, you really have to do a lot of research to figure out what's my best choice. If I need to buy a wood product, for example, so I need to buy some lumber to, put an addition on my house, okay? Or to build a doghouse or whatever. If I want to buy some lumber, how do I know that I'm buying lumber that was harvested in a sustainable way, or at least a less damaging way? So you could go online and do all kinds of research, and that certainly would help. So one really good way that you can pretty relatively easy way to figure out if something is sustainable or not is by using these third-party certifications. Okay, so this is a third-party certification, meaning that it's an independent. The Forest Stewardship Council is this independent body, and what they do is they certify sustainable wood. And so this kind of summarizes what they do. So it goes beyond simple environmental sustainability to affect native rights, and social and environmental conservation, natural forest conservation, make sure harmful chemicals aren't used, respecting national laws, and so forth. And so if I want to buy a wood product or a paper product, anything that's made from a tree, and I don't have the time to go online and do all kinds of research and figure out who do I buy from and so forth, you can just look for this label. Okay, so you may have seen this product on, or this label on products. You see it on packaging, I mean, tissue boxes, paper, copy paper, anything that's made of wood. um, the Forest Stewardship Council is willing to certify. And so the whole point of this is it's a really quick way to figure out if I need to buy something that's made out of a tree. The FSC logo, if I find that, that means it's relatively good. Okay. And we'll kind of skip this question because it delves a little more deeply into how this thing was certified. But I do want to address this, that it's great to have these organizations that certify wood products, but just keep in mind that it's still better environmentally in terms of natural resource management to not buy in the first place. So that should always be your top priority if you want to reduce your impact. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. Okay, so that's the Forest Stewardship Council, and there's links all over this PowerPoint if you want to find some more information. So that's forest management. Now, there are sustainable labels for a lot of different products. Another one is fisheries management. So you had a couple videos that showed you that there are a lot of stresses on fish populations worldwide. Okay, and so according to the Marine Conservation Society, about 32% of the world's fisheries are overexploited, depleted, or recovering. So this is a big deal. Um, uh, and for a number of reasons, but among them, 1 billion people rely on seafood as their sole or primary source of protein. So this is a major social equity issue, a major environmental issue. So the Marine Stewardship Council is also a third-party certifier. They assess every step in the supply chain, so everything from the harvesting to the processing to the shipping to everything else. Okay, and just like Forest Stewardship Council, they are independent and they certify this whole process. Okay. So again, if I want to eat some fish and I go to the grocery store, you can look for this Marine Stewardship Council label. There are other labels out there. There are other sustainability certifications for seafood. But again, it's a lot easier to just look for this label than it is to do a bunch of research. But again, same applies. It's still better to reduce. So, as much, again, you need to eat, that's fine. But if at all possible, you want to reduce. That should always be your first priority. And in terms of fisheries management, I mean, it's just kind of fascinating and sad and amazing kind of all at the same time, the industrial fishing methods that they use. Okay. And so there was a little video that was showed you some of the issues with this. I'm not going to get into too much details, but I think it's pretty fascinating that they actually have these long liners that have fishing lines that are up to 150 kilometers long. So that's like I think it's like it's over 100 miles long. So a single line, like 100 miles long, with thousands of hooks on them. So these things are just dragging behind these giant boats, and they're basically catching whatever gets hooked on there. There are other things. There are trawlers. There are things that dredge against the bottom of the seafloor. I mean, there's all kinds of really damaging stuff. And so one big problem with this is something called bycatch. Uh, so bycatch is what they call the fish or other life that are caught by these long lines or other processes that are not intended to be caught, and so they're they're just dead and they're thrown overboard. So this is called bycatch. Um, Industries are really good at coming up with seemingly innocuous terms or non-threatening terms to describe pretty horrible things. It's pretty common. So bycatch is basically unintended animals that you kill unintentionally that you end up just wasting. Okay, so that's bycatch, and it's a very common part of our industrial fishing industry. Okay, so that's it for this section, and there'll be one more section on natural resources.